It is Thursday, December 9th here at Draft Shark Studios in Rochester, New York, and we are bringing you a special bonus podcast, and it's for a good reason. So we're all doing plenty of best ball drafting throughout the spring and summer at this point, and this week marks the beginning of the playoff portion of the inaugural FFPC Best Ball Championship. And if we're talking best ball, then you know that Tod Burros can't be far away. He pops up like a groundhog whenever somebody says the words. So Tod is at Best Ball NFL on Twitter. He's been a guest on this pod before. He's a competitor in the Draft Sharks Invitational. Tod, thanks for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And you all know the other guy here. He's regularly half of the Deep End podcast on all the Draft Sharks channels and a connoisseur of fantasy football in all its forms. Adam Krautwurst, how you doing?
I am doing great. Thanks for having me. I have a venti peppermint mocha, hot, fresh off the presses, so I'm ready for a long night of football.
Very nice. I'm sure you went in and ordered Taylor style.
Yes.
So if you have been part of the Draft Sharks Discord since the summer, you might have seen Tod on there live streaming two of his entries into the FFPC Best Ball Championship. So we wanted to have Tod on as we got to this portion of the season because, Tod, I understand that both of the teams you drafted while giving these tutorials, talking your way through the draft, I understand they're doing pretty well.
I always say that my best quality is my humility. And no, all kidding aside, they both did, and I did a live draft with another draft sharker. We split it, and 2 weeks ago it was in second place, but it ended up in fourth. So I had a lot of lineups fade at the end. My overall, I was running about 33% pass through for most of the season. And then the injuries at the end, the Antonio Brown injury, DeAndre Swift, Debo, it just knocked me down. But what's interesting is the ones that I did with partners got hit worse somehow. My own of the drafts that I did, I ended up with a 29% pass through, which is, better than acceptable. But it makes me worry a bit about the playoffs to come, all these injuries.
Yeah, and this week is a 1 week playoff in that format, right, Adam?
Yeah, it is for the FFPC, and it was like Tod said, the injuries and the bye weeks now too. I'm in a couple myself. I think I did 8 or 9 maybe of the FFPCs, and I got and I don't really pay attention. I'm more of a lineup setting guy, so I don't really pay attention to the best balls till the very end of the year. It's kind of like a little Christmas present that I get to open, and I had 2 teams make it through, or 3 teams make it through. And I was so excited. Oh, let's see what these rosters look like. And it's Jonathan Taylor. And I'm like, oh no, like he's on a bye. But the cool thing that the FFPC does do is, they re-league everybody who made it through. And there's a couple actually Jonathan Taylor teams in my leagues. So I'm facing myself on a couple teams. So hopefully I can make it through, but it's not about me tonight. It's all about Tod. Yeah, Tod did great. He had 2 Draft Sharks Discord teams that he did live on the Discord. It was great having Tod on the Discord because I know he's a best ball junkie, super successful, and both those teams made it through. Only 2 teams make it through from each league out of 12, I think. So he did really well.
What has gone?
Yeah, right to do it while you're drafting is always, the first year I did it, I thought, oh, no problem. I'm so good. I can be successful while I do a podcast. And historically, my percentages were lower. But not having another guest, I think that just doing a solo by myself, I think that you have an inner monologue anyway when you're doing drafting. So I just shared my inner monologue in my screen with everyone, and I hope all your subs enjoyed it.
Absolutely.
It's always nice to get that kind of insight. What went well for these 2 teams in particular so far? And I guess even beyond that, what has gone well for the teams that are passing through?
Well, I mean, I've got a very unique strategy. I don't hear other people talk about it too much. My best 3 years in best ball, and I'll include this one in it, because you can't, the playoffs are, anything can happen when you're in a league with 12 people. And there's so many overlapping teams and key players that got you there. But to have a pass-through rate, basically 17% is what average is. So I didn't get to double average, but I did pretty darn good. So it's you do the best you can, and my strategy basically is use volume, mix up players within tiers to help mitigate injury as best as possible, take value at ADP when it appears, and rock solid roster construction. And I'm hoping that rock solid roster construction, because everyone was into 0 running back and 4 running back teams. And, I'm hoping that me having very, very solid roster construction is going to pay off for me in the playoffs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know I've seen too, Todd. I was going to ask you about, you were talking about the different roster constructions. I know I'm not a huge best ball guy as far as the amount of leagues that I do. And I kind of forget because it's been so long since I drafted my best ball teams, but I know I've seen the construction out there. It's like, 3 quarterbacks, 7, 6, 5, like all these different strategies of ways to build your team. Do you stand firm to a specific build, or do you kind of does it depend on your draft position? Does it depend on the players that fall?
I'm never going to pass on a great value for a roster construction. I've done an article on this, and I will continue to tweak my process. But basically, I have 7 or 8 tiebreakers within a tier, including things like bye weeks, stacking, and ultimately my exposure. Because the difference between we think the difference between player A and player B and player C within a draft round or a tier is like this big thing. Like you might have one guy 30 points ahead of another guy. Well, we just finished talking about injuries. And that's something you can't really predict, or it's certainly less predictive than a lot of the other things that make up a player's ADP. So I like to, I feel that 2 to 3x on a player, 23% is pretty much how every year is the top I end up with. And so by mixing players within a tier, I'm building kind of almost like a DFS portfolio where I have a bunch of mixes, and I still am over on certain guys and under on others. I don't know if that answered the question, though. I kind of, as often, get distracted with my own voice.
So I just want to follow up on this because I really want to get into more best ball next year, and I always feel super intimidated when it comes to
I do. I'm sorry. Before I forget, let me get this roster construction question. So
yep.
I do. I have a very firm basic construction, but I also am willing to go off of it. So it's 2 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, 8 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends. And that should, off the 2, 7, 15, 17. And then the 18th spot is kind of a floater that can go to whatever the weakest position is. So when you do research, and this is one of the things I find that people make the biggest mistake in best ball, they'll do a 4 running back strategy, but they won't take them when they should go to make that strategy the most effective. Yeah. The people will do a 0 running back, but they'll still only take 5 running backs, right? So if I'm in a draft and all these wide receiver and tight end values are falling to me, I will do a 0 RB build, but I might end up with 6, or I will have at least 6 and sometimes 7 running backs on that team because most of the value on that team is in those early wide receivers. So the 2-5-8-2 with 1 floater is my basic, but based on how the draft goes, I can go 3 quarterbacks, I can go 4 running backs. I can go 7 wide receivers, and certainly I can go 3 tight ends.
Perfect. Did you approach the builds for this kind of tournament and other tournaments on other sites as well? Did you approach drafting these tournament teams differently than you did like drafting best ball teams to play just within a 12-team league?
Yes and no. So underdog, and this was one of the big advantages I felt that I had with the FFPC. People are used to the underdog and before that draft and DraftKings, where you really need kind of a 1% outcome similar to DFS to win a lot of money. The way the FFPC is set up is there's a 4-week playoff and each league is 12 teams. So, and 3 pass through in the playoffs. So you only need a 25% outcome in the FFPC to move on to each round. And then there's only 12 teams in the finals. Compare that to underdog where it's 18-18 and then 164. So definitely a different strategy. And I felt like in FFPC, rock solid roster construction, mixing my exposure was the way to go because I wasn't looking for a 1% outcome. And with 4 weeks of playoffs, it's much less likely that what you do to tweak and supercharge a lineup would make it through 4 weeks anyway.
Sure. That's a good point. Now, you talk about the roster construction being crucial in the FFPC. What did you, Mike and I, Mike Shope and I talked about this Tuesday on the podcast. We talked a lot about the Jonathan Taylor, the bye weeks this week in the FFPC playoffs. Not even, I think we might have touched a little bit on the best ball tournament. Did you fade any, what week are we in, 14? Or 15? Did you fade any bye weeks this week, knowing that it was a 1-week tournament?
No, because again, people oftentimes when you do analysis, one of the big edges is people don't include all the information in that analysis. So what's overlooked often in week 14 buys is that you get these first and second round picks for all 13 weeks of the regular season, giving yourself a better chance to advance and get $300, right, for your $125 investment. So once I thought about that, then I said, okay, I'm not going to fade week 14 teams, but what can I do to ensure that those week 14 teams where I draft week 14 players early, how do I want those to look, right? When do I stop drafting week 14 players? Who am I going to build? So if I take Jonathan Taylor in the first or second round, I'm much more likely to want a good third running back in the top 5 or 6 rounds than I would in a team where I don't have a week 14 running back, right? So what you're constantly doing in best ball is you're kind of moving shells around to cover your weakest parts of your team. And I don't think that's something I read too much about, that I think I understand and that I'm hoping is going to pay off in this tournament.
You mentioned 23% as the high end of player exposure. So is that, you adhere to that? That's as high as you tend to go on certain players. And I guess beyond that, who were the highest exposure players for you in best ball drafting this year?
Sure. Hold on, I'll pull that up. I know. Well, first of all, it's not a hard and fast number, but using the system that I use, where I'm blending and I just always like, the chance of injury. It just seems to work out that I never end up over 23% when I actually do the style that we're talking about here. So. I'm going to pull up real quick. I'm going to go to my friend Fantasy Mojo's site. And I know Deebo Samuel was someone who I had very high ownership of, but I'm going to give you my top players. And what's funny is how many of them aren't that great for the success that I've had, which makes me think that my system is even better than I thought it was. Sure. And that if I actually got the right players this year, I really would have done good. Byron Pringle, 21%. Deebo Samuel. Now, this isn't just the best ball tournament. This is overall all FFPC. But it's pretty indicative because best ball is a much bigger part of my portfolio. Deebo, 21%. Hayden Hurst, 21%. Odell Beckham 17%, Jerick McKinnon 17, Jonnu Smith 17, Antonio Brown 17, Valdez Scantling, and Noah Fant. So and then in the next tier, James Conner, Marquise Brown, AJ Green. It's kind of wild when you see that list and you look at the numbers that I put up. That I was as successful as I was.
Well, yeah, it's also too like when it's the the players from the top of the draft, when you have a higher percentage of them, like Debo and not so much Antonio Brown, he was kind of going in the middle, but those are the guys that can really smash for you. A lot of times you end up with a higher percentage of guys you take in the 17th or 18th round because they're there every single time for you. But yeah, that's interesting.
On that point, though, Adam, I find it amusing every year that whenever people talk about must-have players in the draft, folks are always throwing out like 4th round, 5th round picks.
Right.
Those aren't must-have players. They're guys that are going at value. The guy I want on every roster should be players from like round 12 on, because those are a few players that you value more than other people, and thus you're going to take them a round or two earlier and have them more frequently. And if they don't pay off, it doesn't hurt you. And if they do pay off the way you expect, those are the guys that can win your league.
Well, and this is a very important point. I don't want more than 15% of any player in the first 2 rounds, because the highest win rates and the highest lose rates each year are first and second round players. So again, you don't need a ton, but if like last year, I think I had like 30%. I was going through a divorce. I didn't stick to my own rules, and of course, I end up with 30% Kenyon Drake, and they don't throw him the ball like they did the year before, and I had a down year. And more than that, if it wasn't Kenyon Drake, well, let's say he was doing great, but he got hurt. Right? You don't want to sink 30% of your rosters. Now, some of that ownership is going to be less in the first 2 rounds because you don't have as much ability to get those players due to random draft spot sorting. But even still, you can at times really end up with more than is healthy for you. And, just look at, Christian McCaffrey. If you took him every first pick, if you got a first pick every time and you took him every time, you'd be dead in the water. So injuries are a real big problem in those first and second round picks.
Yeah, that's interesting. The 15%, the 23%. I definitely want to dive more into the details for sure in the spring, because I want to apply this stuff to my drafting.
It works for me.
Yeah,
it works for me because I'm not doing it in a vacuum. I'm doing it as part of a larger strategy of how I mix and match and blend teams. I always compare it to like mixing a mixed drink. You want enough risk in each team, but you don't want too much risk. So if you have a mixed drink and it's really strong, let's call that risk. It's almost undrinkable. You get drunk too quick and you have a shitty night. If you have really not enough alcohol in your drink, you never get a buzz and you have a shitty night. So, it's really important. It's really important when I talk is that you have to realize it's part of a larger strategy. And, if you crunch numbers and looked at overall everyone who did this, it might not work for them. But it works for me because it fits into a larger picture.
I think Adam tends to put a little too much of the risky stuff in his Josh Allen Kool-Aid, so we might need to have a mixology podcast with you at some point.
Josh Allen was all Bills were early. Most Bills were fades for me this year, and most Packers were fades for me because I felt last year that both offenses were about as efficient as they could be. And that regression historically with offenses that efficient, whether it's the 2007 Patriots or Peyton Manning's big year, Dan Marino's big year, as Pat Mahomes' big year, it's very hard to repeat that. And ADP, you're basically paying for as if that efficiency is going to be repeated.
Now, you mentioned that mistake of yours from last year and going a little overweight on Kenyon Drake and some early round guys. Were there any mistakes that you made this year now that you're kind of in the looking back phase? Is there anything that you want to sharpen?
And what sucks about it is I identified it. I've known it's one of my weaknesses for years. And it's almost everyone's weakness. We see that one guy and we just don't like him, whether it's the cut of his jib or whatever it is. Oh, I'm not drafting that MFer in the third round. I'm just not going to do it. Right. And I got a lot better at adapting as the season goes on and really analyzing everything that goes into making someone's ADP worthwhile. And the one guy I didn't do it to was Cooper Kupp. I was like, the guy's coming off 2 injuries. He's going in the 4th round. I ended up with 3% Cooper Kupp. Another reason why it's kind of amazing that I got as much pass through as I did. And it was just bad process because I liked the fact that Matt Stafford went there. I liked the offense. But I got it in my head that a guy who makes sharp cuts coming off of 2 straight knee injuries was bad. And I wouldn't have wanted to be even weight on him, but it's egregious to only have 3% of a guy in an offense that good. I should have been in the 5 to 6% range. And that's the one that I'm kicking myself on the most. That's the one where I knew I should analyze the situations deeper, and I did it overall, but I just didn't do it with the Rams.
See, Todd spent too much time in the best ball portion of the Discord, because if he was in the other parts of the Discord also, he'd have seen Draft Sharks was loving. And what's funny, Todd, is when I'm talking about like exposures and percentages, you're saying 23%. I'm like, man, in my mind, I'm thinking, man, I wish I had 30% of Cooper Kupp because I had a lot of Cooper Kupp and I don't do a ton of best ball, but that would have been the guy this year because I have so much of him in redraft that, man, I wish I had 30% of Cooper Kupp.
Well, I mean, and it's always easy to, one of the things that, again, you see this time of year is, no, you wouldn't. Because, yes, he had a great year and he didn't get injured, but he could have, right? Right. Yep. So I wish I had 30% of Cooper Kupp is great now looking back afterwards. But, who is a guy in that range that we could have said the same thing about maybe who got hurt?
Robert Woods.
Robert Woods, right? Robert Woods was right in that area. And if you had gone 30% Robert Woods, you would really struggle to be profitable just based on that one bit of ownership because he was a late third, early 4th round pick. If 30% goes up in flames, you're in trouble. So you kind of actually proved my point of why I believe the way that I do. And look, it's always easy afterwards to say, I wish I'd done this. I wish I hadn't done this. I always try and remember, and I think it's a strength of mine, why I made the decision I did. Was it the right decision at the time? And would I do it again? And so I kicked myself that I didn't own more Cooper Kupp, but not that I, was way over on him.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't mean for that to sound like I was scolding you.
No, every once in a while he needs it, I think.
I need a good scold.
Adam is really good at this stuff. So mucho respecto.
Thank you, sir.
Well, we're going to have to run a translator on this podcast, I think, for anybody who's watching the video back on YouTube.
Well, the good news is I'm thinking of doing a really in-depth best ball thing. And I don't know where I'm going to do it, if I'll do it alone, if I'll do it in conjunction with the site. And if I do it, it won't be cheap. But I will tell you that I will go through everything. If it's worth my while, I will interpret the Greek for you very, very patiently.
Nice.
Listen, sign me up. I'm in.
Yes, I will be interested in that project wherever it might come out because it's.
Well, let me throw an idea out at you. One of the key tenets is, remember how I just said that, what am I missing here, right? Like, what did I miss on Cooper Cup? I want to have sessions where, like, in each tier, I color code how much I like those players. But then we sit there and we invite everyone into a Discord, and I do a live show where we just go through and say, okay, I'm down on Cooper Cup this year. What am I missing? Right? Talk me off it. And maybe you won't, but I really feel like a group that's sitting there sharpening each other and making sure that we're cutting off those blind spots that is just inherent in human nature, where you just put up a wall. That's one of the big things that I would, if I do it, that's one of the big things I want to do.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good point, Todd, to do. You're talking more preseason, like during draft season. I think it's just as important. I think you would agree. And Matt and Jared do a great job of this after the season, is grading ourselves and figuring out, taking notes and figuring out, like, why did I miss what was it, figuring out those blind spots when it comes, and when we hit on players like Cooper Cup or whoever, like, what made us, how did we hit that? Like what, and just figure out, because it feels like, man, the next year, like, I promise you, I will do a draft for 2022 before January's out. And I don't want to move on to the next season without having that process, So
Agreed.
I think it's very important to do.
And the most important thing in life, never mind fantasy football, is being honest with yourself. And it's not an easy thing to do, to really look at yourself in the mirror of good and bad. So yeah, I agree with you, Adam.
Yeah, I was going to say too, what I have found is helping my drafting more lately, and lineup setting for that matter, is not so much focusing on the number side, because we've been doing projections for years and you can get projections from so many places at this point, but thinking about why I'm playing certain ways, what's blocking me from doing certain things, what is, like what Todd was saying, what's turning me off to that player? Is it really somebody I should totally avoid? Or do I just mix them in some in case something totally different than what I think is going to happen happens? I think it's important to, obviously you have the numbers that lay the base for everything, but then to get a little bit more, a little bit more theoretical on it, and think about why, and write all the stories.
Understanding your own biases. Right? Understanding your own biases. And my biases aren't going to be yours. My strengths aren't going to be yours. My weaknesses aren't, but we can learn it. We're going to have pieces of each other that fit, right? Like a Venn diagram, there's going to be overlap. And that's why I think a group working in concert together can be stronger.
And in the end, hopefully we have a mosaic of fantasy success.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most frustrating things, and I'm sure you guys are well aware of it, when you do content, a lot of times you tell people what to do and they still don't do it. And then they come back to you when they fail and say, I did what you told me to and I failed. And you're like, you really didn't. Right? Like let's say it was zero running back. I said, sure, I'll do zero running back, but, or like two quarterbacks. They'll say, I did two quarterbacks and I had a lousy year. Well, when did you draft them? Well, I would always draft one in the 12th round and one in the 17th round. No, no, that's not enough. That's not enough. Right. Mm-hmm. So, it's not just, and that's what I mean by mixing those things around. Mm-hmm. Each position needs enough value to give you a good chance to have a winning score.
Mm-hmm. Well, Todd, we very much appreciate you joining us and sharing your insight into this best ball. And I'm sure that we'll have you back on here again, because it's fun competing against you and talking with you about all this stuff. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Adam, thank you for joining us and helping to pick Todd's brain so we can get as much info out of him as possible while we have him available.
Yeah, I did. I went a little too deep, so we didn't get to everything.
No, listen, my only question left for tonight is Dalvin Cook. We rolling with Dalvin? What are we doing with Madison? I mean, we're under the gun.
Well, I mean, I have one team, in the main event going for the finals that I'm sharing with Clutch by Shelley. And our other choice is P. Ryan and, a bunch of guys that you just can't play. James Hasty. So that's an easy start for me. What's frustrating is I looked at my 31 teams that advanced, and there was like 3 Dalvin teams. Then I looked, but there was like 7 Madison teams. I'm like, fuck.
Yeah,
So I'm hoping that Dalvin gets 2 early long touchdowns, tweaks his shoulder on the second touchdown, and then Madison gets there too.
That's the best thing about best ball is you don't have to make the decision.
Well, and that, I always call best ball the one night stand of fantasy football, because it really is like everyone loves to draft. Now you guys are really good at grinding, but I get so caught up. It's really hard for me to grind, especially doing DFS.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a killer. Figuring out the balance is one of the toughest parts of playing fantasy at this point with all the volume going on. Well, that's going to do it for this special edition of the podcast. You can join the Draft Sharks Discord that we have been talking about for free. Get insight from high stakes.
I thought we were already done and we were talking privately. So
don't worry.
If anyone doubted that I wasn't a genius, I can't even tell when there's a little red button on the screen.
Yeah, when it says live, does that mean that we're live or just like we're all live? So
I looked up when you started doing the closing again, and I'm like, oh, frick.
We'll cut out the naughty portions before the audio version goes out because we know we have lots of third graders listening to the podcast.
Yes.
Anyway,
some of them are very good
in the DS Discord. You can find the link to do that in the notes for this podcast. For our guest, Tod Burros, Adam Krautwurst, and the entire Draft Sharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.